Okay, this is week number 7, lucky 7, huh? So, what are we talking about in this lucky week?
We're going to talk about... How come it's lucky? We're going to talk about the other stuff, which is really fun, really exciting.
The other stuff?
Yeah, what is the other stuff?
Well, the other stuff is like all these sort of fancy schmancy stuff like atmosphere and light bloom and sort of post effects and stuff like that, huh?
Yeah. This is really kind of a fun class because it's not like we're teaching... This is kind of a little bit of a techniques class. And we're going to get into a little bit of philosophy and fun storytelling stuff. It's going to touch upon a little bit of technical stuff, how lighting actually works and why certain things look the way they do in film. And then we're also going to get into kind of this other world of post effects, which is fun.
Let's take a look at it.
Okay.
This week we're going to talk about the other stuff. What is the other stuff?
The other stuff is just, I think, covering things related to lighting. Stuff like we're going to talk about atmosphere, talk about exposure a little bit more, especially its relation to storytelling, I think. And also, I think, post effects, things that you could do to alter images, things that happen to alter images in film and how that relates to creating imagery.
Yeah, this is kind of cool. I mean, it is kind of like a bit of a icing on the cake kind of thing that you can add in the end, or you can bring sort of extra effect to certain things, but it can actually influence your storytelling quite a bit, huh?
Yeah. Where should we start?
Let's start with atmosphere.
So atmosphere is a tricky thing. Yeah, so we have 3 exactly the same balls kind of copied into space. No atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And then, kind of my understanding of atmosphere a long time ago used to be, when I first started painting, was let's just add these semi-transparent layers of blue that equally affect kind of light and shadow. And, the closer it is, the less layers there are, the further back, the more layers there are. Yeah. And the end result is looking something like this, which, I don't know. I mean, it looks like it's kind of receding in space, but there's something odd about it.
Yeah. This is because you have this equal amount of influence of the atmosphere on the object all over the place, on the shadow side and light side. And the true atmosphere, well, of course depends on the type of atmosphere. If it's like an underwater, it'll look more like that, or if it's like a fog, it feels like a fog, right? Foggy.
Like a dense fog.
When it's really dense, then it starts to influence even on the light side. But in the kind of, healthy atmosphere that we normally know is sort of like it's a particle. Our atmosphere is a particle illuminated by the light. So it influences more on the shadow side, like that. Mm-hmm. See the difference? And this is more like what you would normally see, because the light travels through the atmosphere, but the shadow doesn't. That's why you get more influence on the shadow side.
Right. And so what would happen if we did an object really far away?
Right. So it starts to influence your light side, of course, but then the shadow side is almost getting close to the sky color.
And right, so the sky color is actually something to consider when you're creating atmosphere like this. So if I look at the blue that is in the shadow, the cast shadow of the closest object, and the blue of the object that's really far away, is that the same blue coming from the same place?
It should be, in the sense. The only thing is that the sky you might be comparing it to may be in a different distance too. So oftentimes you can't just put the exact same blue, then it'll look a little off, because sky meaning it's behind the horizon and your object should be definitely in front of the horizon. So, but all in general, it should be in a similar range, right?
Absolutely, right. And so, talk about this a little bit more, and then we'll move on to something else. But is the light side being affected by the blue?
Yes, it is.
Just not as much as the shadow.
Not as much, yeah.
Great. And I think that's something to observe. Don't just take our word for it. I think you need to go out and check it out. Go look at things. Go look at things that are kind of going in a distance. And look at it on different times of day and kind of different levels of atmosphere in the air. And I think just studying painting always will help you with this. Let's look at some real painted examples of this. So this is an Edgar Payne, painted with kind of atmosphere in it.
Yeah, it's such an epic. You can see how big this landscape is. The scale of it. I mean, of course, placing these cowboys or the Indians, in front of it is one thing, but also because of the atmosphere pushing back the landscape, it really makes you feel like, oh my God, this is immense.
This is a good example of what we just talked about, that the atmosphere is not equally affecting both the light and shadow side of it. But there is an overall tint of blue. Even with kind of the warm bounce light that's in those shadows, you still see that influence of the blue atmosphere.
That's where it gets really tricky. You have, if you look at the cast shadow of this cliff is bluer than the core shadow because, the local color is influenced by the sky field light, which is blue. And then the core shadow is influenced by the bounce light, and that's why it's warm. But then on top of it, you have this atmosphere influence. So, it starts to get a little bit complicated.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I love this painting. When I first saw this painting, I was like, I kept looking at it forever. But you can see how gigantic this giant is. If you squint at it, like he's really blending back into the sky.
Yeah, and I think this is really like an effective use of story to the atmosphere to help tell a story. This painting is such a classic American illustration, and it's about these kids seeing this giant on the beach.
And what's really effective is that you have a sort of a visual reference of the giant behind the atmosphere, and then you have these kids who are very close to the camera, so you can see how much distance in between these two elements.
Let's look at another N.C. Wyeth image. And this is, I think a more classic, little simpler, effective use of atmosphere. And I think this is probably how most people will be using atmosphere to tell stories more traditionally, more kind of less to show scale and more to just evoke a mood. Light coming through the atmosphere and simplifying the backgrounds. I mean, one thing that is great about atmosphere is it does much. This is a great example of how atmosphere can help you simplify something.
Yeah, because it influences, bright, it basically kind of puts a layer of color, semi-transparent color, in front of objects. So that means, value structure that's behind it will be simplified. It gets closer to the atmosphere color. And that's a great tool to put it behind your characters, if it makes sense. Yeah.
And this is where a good example of the density of fog. It looks appropriate here because the fog feels really dense.
Yep.
And here's a Howard Pyle painting from his famous book of Pirates.
Why does this ship look gigantic? Because of the atmosphere that's kind of cutting down the contrast, the valley contrast, especially not the back end of the ship, but if you really look at the ship area that's in the back in space, that's really coming together closer in value. That's why it's really pushed back. It really looks big.
Here's a Harvey Dunn painting at night. Here's a night painting. Atmosphere happens at night as well. I think that's really important to remember as well.
Yeah. Because the atmosphere is created by light, particles lit, so it is less than the daytime. That's one thing to remember, but doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Of course it does, because if there's no light, even at night, you can't see anything. That means it's black, pitch black. You can't see anything. The fact that you're seeing something means, of course, there's light.
Let's look at an extreme example of atmosphere. Here's some Whistler paintings.
Yeah, Whistler's a master of these sort of foggy, river scenes, and it's really cool.
These feel like really simple images. I think that's something key to remember about atmosphere. It does help you, like especially thick atmosphere like this, helps you to simplify an image. This really feels like kind of this foggy night, and you could just hear the bells kind of ringing out, kind of fog horns. Mm-hmm. It's really an evocative. It's such a simple, elegant statement, but with such a great use of atmosphere. He's just such a master of it. Totally. I mean, I feel like even here, you feel a little bit of that city glow beyond that horizon.
You can almost feel like a moisture on your cheek or something. It's just really, really beautiful.
I don't know about that.
I could. Yeah, but no.
I feel like Dyson and I just had a moment. Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's so bold in a way to be this simple with it and be this kind of clear with it. Let's look at other examples. These are great painting examples, but I think looking at some real story, we're going to get into story. We're beginning to talk about story. Let's look at some real effective uses of fog specifically for film. Blade Runner, it's an important film. Effective use of atmosphere. Even in like an interior, it's used to kind of really create, this is almost a visual style that's so specific to Blade Runner.
Yep. One of the, if you look at the screen left, it really creates the sense of scale of this gigantic metropolis, and obviously, if you look at the room, it's such a signature Blade Runner imagery of, a room with a huge, big sort of dense atmosphere with the big, room ceiling fan.
Yeah. So cool. Yeah. It's kind of helped to define sci-fi imagery. And it's so simple. Again, there's so much atmosphere, you really don't see much of the room. It's not this super high-tech anything.
Yeah, totally.
It's really beautiful. Let's go back in time to a film set in a different period, Barton Fink by the Coen brothers. One of your favorite cinematographers, Roger Deakins. But I love here his use of kind of atmosphere and an interior to create this specific story and mood.
I think it might be the first time they worked together, because I know Miller's Crossing was in Roger Deakins. But yeah, it's if you are familiar with the film, it really creates this mood. The mood is so much about the film, I feel like, and just kind of creepy, mysterious characters in this movie is created by a lot of the atmosphere. And you put that imagery on the lower right that doesn't have a lot of atmosphere, just to show the contrast.
Yeah, right. And so these are all images from Barton Fink, but it's great to see the contrast too, and how effective contrast can be, especially when obviously you don't look at the film like this where 4 frames right next to each other, but having the benefit of that, you can see the contrast and how much mood can be evoked from the atmosphere. And again, this is purely for storytelling. It'd be actually pretty unique to get this much atmosphere on the inside of a hotel in a room where the cameras, and it's not like there's that much space. So this is really very much a conscious choice to put atmosphere on these interiors. Here's aliens using atmosphere for a completely different feeling than Barton Fink. Really creepy. Used in almost like a very thrilling way. James Cameron, uses it to, again, simplify these really complex backgrounds, but also to really carve out these silhouettes. That's what I love, is his atmosphere is used so effectively to... He has such unique, these aliens and the robot that Sigourney Weaver gets in is such iconic imagery for this series, and atmosphere really helps to create that really memorable imagery.
Yeah. I think a lot of the horror movie genre will, start to be defined with this fog,
It's such a great thing to mask things in and hide things in.
And, kind of let audience imagine what's behind.
Yeah, so cool. Scary. Have you watched this one? You don't like scary films as much.
I watched the first two.
Yeah.
That was it, yeah.
Dice is not a big fan of scary films. Okay, let's move on. Let's look at this film, Children of Men. I really enjoy Alfonso Cuarón's world. He creates these very believable worlds that are fantastic, but also he uses cinematography in a great way. And the reason why we're looking at these is kind of the contrast between both of them. You could say that the light has this bloom effect, but some of it is created out of atmosphere and some of it is out of exposure, and they're kind of two different things.
Yeah, so atmosphere is obviously it's the physical phenomena, the particles in the air that's saturated by the light. On the other hand, the light bloom, is when your eyes cannot take, a certain point when the eye perceives a certain sort of value structure, and when it gets brighter and brighter and brighter, it doesn't get any more brighter, and it starts to bleed into the surrounding areas. So if you can imagine, simply if you look at the sun, everything will be white and you just can't see anything.
Although we don't recommend that for artists who need their eyes.
Please don't do it. Or if you do it, don't blame us.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a bit of a difference. There's a bit of a difference between the atmosphere versus sort of perception-based sort of bloom, like a light bloom. Like lens flare is definitely one of them, right?
Yes, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about exposure. Let's go from atmosphere and start talking about exposure. So this is a film, The Express, beautifully shot film. And these are great different examples of how exposure might work. So, you were talking about shooting right into the sun. This top left frame is the camera pointed right at the sun and a character coming in front of it. And you could see there how the sun just kind of bleeds over the shadow side of this character. The exposure of it is, the camera can't take that contrast.
The reason why it is like that is that, of course, you want to be able to see the character here, and the character is in the shadow against the sun. That's why it's overexposed, and the sun, even sky is blown out.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if you look at the image next to it on the right, you can see this interior scene where, it almost looks like they're looking into this glowing pool of light. Now, this is a good thing to talk about, both in terms of light and shadow. So light is directly hitting upon that desk, that table between them. But the bounce light is actually bouncing onto their faces. And so, the cinematographer here decided to expose for the bounce light, the kind of, to really expose specifically for that. And so what happens is then the background, which is darker, drops away into black, and the light blows out. And you see the light blooms kind of between the foreground characters. You see that bloom of light. That's not necessarily atmosphere. That's exposure.
Yeah. And in this case, I think it's probably, the DP decided to kind of crunch to create this contrast. So the darks are actually dropping quite a bit, and then the light is actually, and you have this kind of narrow range in the middle. That's what the camera is exposing, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, another good example is the one on the bottom right where you're really exposed for light, so everything else, drops off into shadow.
Yeah.
Almost the opposite of the top left image.